Good evening and welcome. I'm Kevin Butterfield, the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. I'm actually sitting in the reading room here at Mount Vernon, a rare thrill these days. On behalf of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Pandemics in American History. We're doing things a little differently this year, and we're glad you could join us from your homes virtually due to the coronavirus pandemic that's keeping us all socially distant. A year ago, very few of us could have imagined that we'd be living in this world, a world where masks are the rule. This is one that's actually in plastic wrapping. This one is not. These are the kinds of masks that many of you actually will be receiving in the mail, thanks to your generous donations as registrants for this event. You'll be getting one of three. This is one version that I particularly like. Thank you for that. Thank you for your support of Mount Vernon. But now we live in that world, and it's a world that very few of us saw coming. One exception might be some of our guests here tonight who may have anticipated or at least had a better sense of what a pandemic would be like. Our all-star lineup tonight will take a comprehensive look at the various pandemics that have plagued our nation since its inception, providing context for the crisis we live through today and a better sense of our own history. They'll examine the diseases, responses, leadership during various key moments in our nation's collective health. They will discuss the outcomes that arguably changed the trajectory of history. And if past is prologue, which obviously it is, hopefully they will provide some guidance for what we can expect in the coming months and years as the COVID-19 pandemic continues. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm sure you're as excited as I am to meet our speakers tonight and to get a chance to hear them talk about diseases in our past and in our present. First, Elizabeth Finn. Professor Elizabeth Finn teaches at the University of Colorado Boulder. She studies the early American West, focusing on epidemic disease, Native American environmental history. She wrote a book called Pax Americana, the Great Smallpox Epidemic of 1775 to 82, that unearthed the devastating effects of the smallpox epidemic that coursed through North America during the early years of the American Revolution. Welcome, Dr. Finn, and thank you for coming to join us here tonight.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I am delighted to be here.
That's great. John Barry is going to be our next guest, a prize-winning and New York Times bestselling author who wrote a book called The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history, a study of that 1918 pandemic that I believe we all know more about now than we did just a little while before. He was named by the National Academies of Science his book, was named by the National Academies of Science as an outstanding book in science or medicine. He's currently a distinguished scholar at Tulane's Bywater Institute and a professor at the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Barry.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Dr. Ashish Jha is the Dean of the Brown University School of Public Health. He recently served as the KT Lee Professor of Global Health at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute before coming to Brown. He is someone that you may have seen many times on TV. Even my 2-year-old recommends or can recognize him from watching the Today Show each morning with me, which she calls the weather, but she's excited to see someone who I point out every time as I'm going to get to meet that guy. He's led groundbreaking research around Ebola and is now on the front lines of the COVID-19 response. Dr. Jha leads national analyses of key issues around the COVID-19 pandemic and advises policymakers at the state and federal level, appears frequently on national television news outlets, as I know, and he's a vocal advocate for increased testing and contact tracing, who has written extensively on the subject of the pandemic that has us all in our homes today. It's an honor to have you, Dr. Jha.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me here.
Oh, this is outstanding. Finally, I'd like to introduce medical Dr. James Hamblin. Dr. Hamblin is a staff writer for The Atlantic, a lecturer at the Yale School of Public Health. He has a book out called Clean that was named an editor's pick by the New York Times Book Review. His writing and his videos have appeared at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. I am thrilled to be able to hand things over to Dr. Hamblin to engage with you all on this fascinating but gripping and difficult topic, pandemics across American history. Come join us, Dr. Hamblin, so I can hand over the screen to you. Jim, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's an honor to handle the screen. I am a journalist and medical doctor, but I am not a historian. I am barely qualified to even ask questions about history, so I'm humbled to to be here. I will hopefully be a proxy for the audience in learning today. I want to ask that people put questions in the chat and comments if there are things that we're overlooking or additions to the conversation. I'll keep an eye there. I'd like to make this interactive and engaging for everybody and make sure we take it in the directions that you'd like to go.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. Let me step aside and hand over things to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for being here. So a word that keeps getting thrown around right now, I find myself using it too, is unprecedented. I would not be surprised if it's the word of the year. In fact, there is a lot of precedent for a lot of what is happening, and probably a few people understand the precedents better than those three of you before us. So hopefully, maybe those of you watching, next time you hear someone refer to something unprecedented, you'll be able to say, actually, no, I learned. So I want to start just by kind of doing a little meta background on each of you on, you had this foresight to sort of devote years of your life. I've written a book. I know you throw yourself all into these topics before they're immediately pressing. You had to throw yourself into the topic of pandemics specifically with the books that you've written, Elizabeth and John. And I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit, starting with Elizabeth, what drew you to want to, your books were 2002 and 2004 respectively. At that time, go into the deep annals of history and really bring pandemic to life.
Yeah, I came to smallpox, which was the subject that I wrote about. I wrote about a horrific epidemic that swept all of North America during the years of the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1782. So almost exactly the years of the Revolutionary War. And I came to it very much sideways. I had started graduate school, and I actually dropped out of graduate school, was doing manual labor. And a friend of mine gave me a book to read, a novel called The Horseman on the Roof. It's a French novel. I read it in English by a gentleman named Jean Giono. It was published in 1952, I think. And it was about a cholera epidemic that an Italian nobleman making his way home through Provence in the midst of this chaos. And that tripped some memories for me about coming across anecdotes about smallpox on the Western Plains of Canada when I was researching an undergraduate thesis. And it really catalyzed me to return to graduate school in order to write the story of what turned out to be this immense smallpox epidemic. I aspired to write as well as Jean Giono and disappointed myself in that respect. But I was really catalyzed by the literary endeavor. And then I became obsessed with the historical challenge of tracking smallpox and really watching how it revealed so much else about North America at that time.
Right. Well, I guess while we're on that, before we move on to John's backstory, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by what it revealed about America at that time? As I understand it, it's something that is taught in history books as a sort of part of the story, but in fact was probably more formative than most people understand to the directions of our early formation of our country.
Yeah, it absolutely changed outcomes during the Revolutionary War in various episodes, and Americans were more vulnerable to it than British, or most British were, because smallpox was not yet endemic in the Americas. So people weren't exposed to it and they didn't have immunity for the most part. But beyond the Revolutionary War, where it really was huge, and George Washington decided to inoculate the troops on this major decision, it also revealed communication patterns, commerce patterns, warfare, it all across the continent. In ways, it just kind of gave a snapshot that I would never have had access to without smallpox guiding my way.
Right. Okay. So more on smallpox to come. John, by way of introduction, can you give a little bit of the meta story of what brought you to writing The Great Influenza, which I imagine many people here have read, kind of the definitive text on the influenza pandemic of 1919, or as the president would say, 1917.
First, I want to compliment you and the Atlantic for its coverage of this pandemic. I think the press in general has done a terrific job. Certainly, the Post and the Times, which I read daily, and the Atlantic has just done an outstanding job. And it may come up. I have a story idea for you that I think needs to be covered. Something that I don't know the answer to.
Perfect. Story ideas welcome. Leave them in the chat.
Okay. I guess for me, it goes back to the beginning. When I was a kid, I always wanted to do two things and only two things: biomedical research or write. Obviously, I chose to become a writer. I know there are people like you who are, who can both do science and write, and there's some, outstanding people who do both, but not me. And like Elizabeth, the actual subject came to me almost by serendipity, not quite. I was always aware of the pandemic. I'm not quite sure why, but I wanted to write a book about the home front in World War I, culminating in the events of 1919, which I think is one of the most interesting years in American history, as 2020 and 2021 are unfortunately about to be. And I just ended up getting diverted into doing an entire book on the pandemic. Exactly why is probably too boring to get into.
Okay.
I when I started it, I thought it was going to be pretty easy. I thought it would take me probably 2 years, which for me is a very short time for a book. And at most, I thought worst case 2.5 to 3 years. But unfortunately, it took me 7 years. For 5.5 of those years, I wanted to throw the whole thing out the window. But I'm a writer. I live on in advance, and I couldn't afford to pay it back. But at just about 5.5 years into it, things started to come together. And obviously, I'm happy with the product.
Yeah. And it's seen a lot of interest recently, right? Resurgence of people reading the book, as I understand it. I think it was back on the bestseller list. And so you had to push yourself through that, though, because you were seeing that this is clearly an important story to tell, that there are lessons here that people need to learn. You don't throw yourself into a 7-year book project just for kicks. What was it that was pulling you through, saying, there's something here that America needs to reckon with, or the world needs to reckon with, that it hasn't yet?
I don't know. It was quite that. I know that there's a character in the book named, he's a person, Oswald Avery. And he had an extraordinary, great scientist, probably the most deserving of the Nobel Prize, who never won it. And his struggles over a period of 25 years really kept me going. DNA was identified in 1868. Nobody knew what it did. Avery discovered demonstrated that it carried the genetic code in an extraordinarily controversial experiment and paper at the time in 1944. But just seeing what he went through, and that was actually an outgrowth of his work on the influenza pandemic, which is why I covered it in the book. And just what he went through and the failures that he dealt with over a course of time kind of kept me going. And as I said earlier, it did come together at 5 years, 6 months, 12 days, 14 hours, something like that. I sort of saw the light of organization and things like that.
Wow. And were you surprised by the response to it?
I don't know. Obviously, I was pleased. I don't know if I was surprised. I think every time any writer writes a book, they both hope and expect to be successful. Most of the time, we're disappointed. Yeah. I've certainly been disappointed in response to some other books.
I guess I'm thinking in terms of, you close the book by saying, those in authority, must retain the public's trust. Sort of, what are our weak points for looking ahead toward pandemics? The way to do that is to distort nothing, to put the best face on nothing, to try to manipulate no one. Lincoln said that first and best. A leader must make whatever horror exists concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart. So we read your book, the country read your book, the world did, and yet seems we fell prey to that fallacy, that error, nonetheless.
Well, some countries did, and some countries did not. There are countries that have done very well. I'm not saying it certainly wasn't because they read my book. It's pretty clear, I think, what the best policy is to pursue, and the truth is the best policy in something like this. Countries with as few resources as Senegal have done a great job, and countries with as many resources as the United States have done a horrific job.
Yeah. Well, that leads nicely to Dr. Zhao, who studies health policy and how the systems can improve, and has been a leading voice in the current pandemic, and has seen some of these disparities play out, where it's not that the U.S. doesn't have the financial resources to have done better than we are, but it seems that we simply haven't learned from history the historic lessons of how you came to contain a pandemic and these fundamental basic principles. I know you've said it many times, but if there were 2 or 3 lessons from history that we should have been paying better attention to, what jumps to mind for you?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. And I will start off by just talking about, obviously, I'm the non-historian of the 3 panelists. And my venture into pandemics really starts about 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I led this international commission that looked at the global response to Ebola and what went wrong there. And it seems almost quaint to think about what went wrong, given how badly things have gone with this pandemic. And it became really clear from both watching the global response to that pandemic, reading books like John's, which I had read, that there were some key fundamental principles of what was to come that nobody was paying attention to, or not enough people were paying attention to. So it was very clear 5 years ago, I put together actually a course on preventing the next pandemic, in which I asked every one of the experts I had, will the world be ready in 5 years if there's a pandemic? Not knowing that it would in fact be in 5 years, but this sense that this was coming. This was coming this year, maybe in 5 years, maybe it would have happened 2 years ago, but undoubtedly this was coming. Mm-hmm. And the key lessons of preparedness, of how leadership needs to communicate and be engaged, it just didn't seem like that was on front of mind. And one of the points that I often made as I tried to advocate for more focus on pandemics was I said, there are these kind of tail risk events, these things that we as society worry immensely about: the nuclear weapon going off in a big city, the catastrophic environmental, massive earthquake in San Francisco. They're unlikely, but we spend enormous resources preparing for them because they would be catastrophic. There is one big tail risk which we basically largely ignore, and that's a pandemic. And it was interesting because everybody sort of got it, and yet we just did very little to get ready for this one. And then when it hit, one of the things that struck me, and I guess I was most surprised by it, and having read John's book, I should not have been surprised, was I actually thought America was going to be pretty well prepared. And I wrote a piece in January in which I said, and I'm embarrassed to say this, and if you want to shut off my video for the rest of this discussion.
I'm about to, yeah.
Yeah. I said America was going to do well in this pandemic because we had all of the capacity to handle this pandemic. And I have reflected quite a bit on all the ways in which I got that wrong. But it was largely because I I underestimated and really misunderstood the political challenges in our country in a way that I had not.
Yeah.
Well, people talk about black swan events, and I've heard this described. I mean, this is not a black swan.
Yeah.
Dr. Shah.
Yeah.
No.
So just for the audience, define what you mean by black swan event.
Well, a very unusual event. A low probability, high impact. This has been described to me. It's not my phrase, but a gray rhino. It's a high probability and high impact. Yeah. Everyone in the public health community has predicted this. Expected it to be an influenza virus, but the preparation is absolutely exactly the same. And we went through SARS and MERS and Zika, and West Nile sort of is a non-event, which won't waste time talking about. But H5N1, H7N9, so forth and so on. Everybody's expecting this, and preparations were made. And when the Bush administration got serious about this, when H5N1 resurfaced, and right after SARS, and I was, I guess, part of the sort of conceptualizing the non-pharmaceutical intervention stuff like that. The Bush administration passed a bill of several $1 billion. Did all sorts of things, helped fund the national stockpile and so forth and so on, planning events, and there were plans in place. They were ignored. I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's sort of something a big thing to leave sitting. I mean, can you say a little bit more about why would we ignore these things? Are there any lessons, maybe, if we can keep it apart from just saying the politics of it, the lessons from history about our interest in addressing certain threats over others, or the urgency of what makes us move into and out of these patterns of preparedness that we seem to have found ourselves
in terms of the actual dollars and resources. I'm sure Dr. Shah can probably give you much more detail than I can. Okay. But it really comes down to the leadership, one person at the top. Whenever I was involved in preparedness meetings and, or giving a talk or something, I always said, the thing is, someone above the pay grade. The number one lesson from 1918, in my view, was to tell the truth. Dr. Shah has essentially said the same thing. Communication is so essential in public health. And someone above the pay grade of the head of the CDC is going to make the decision as to what message to give out. And they may make the decision to leave it to CDC or, some other health professional, or not. And we have a president who chose to politicize it. It's just astounding. I think everybody in public health associated with is just amazed. It's incomprehensible what happened.
Yeah,
I mean, I do think there are some precedents for the level of denial, in particular, that we're seeing. When I think back to the terrible cholera epidemics of the 19th century, especially the 1832 epidemic, as it approached New York City, people started to get wind of it, and quite frankly, the commercial interests in New York City kind of shut down information because they didn't want trade to be hindered. And there's no doubt that in 1832 and 1849, also, another cholera outbreak, there were similar mechanisms of denial in play, but the outcome of that was the development of a public health infrastructure, public boards of health. I mean, there's another epidemic in 1866 that did not do what the earlier cholera epidemics did. So we actually learned from that and implemented steps to contain that kind of contagion in the future.
Right. And when I read books like yours that are detailing like sort of the origins of public health and cholera epidemics that led to the foundations of modern sanitation and hygiene, it seems like, was this just a different mindset back then, that we would actually come together and try to solve problems because it was simply necessary? And is that gone now? Why does that seem so much more difficult for us to do now than in at least some of the past pandemics? And I can throw that to anyone. I know it's a difficult question.
Let me start by saying, and I'm not going to compare it to others in the past so much, because I feel like there are two people whose views I'd much rather hear than my own. But I will tell you what I think has made this pandemic so incredibly difficult to manage. And part of it is I still don't totally understand, because I agree that we've had possibly the worst kind of imaginable leader for this moment. But there's something also about the fact that so much of our country has been susceptible to that, because it isn't just our president at the top. It's a whole bunch of governors. It's a large chunk of our population. And these are good people who don't want to propagate a pandemic. And so the question is, what is going on? And the best I can understand it, and again, I'd love help in figuring this out, is along with the pandemic has been this very concerted effort at misinformation, disinformation, that I don't know if that's been there in previous pandemics, but it has really undermined any sense of national response, any sense of even agreement on the basic book of facts. If a 60-year-old with high blood pressure gets coronavirus and dies, like, there are people who say, well, that's not coronavirus.
Right.
It's the blood pressure problems. I mean, just a level of insanity that has made it seem like it's made it very, very hard to have any kind of national resolve, any kind of collective action. And a lack of collective action makes it very hard to fight any kind of outbreak. So I think that misinformation, propagated largely through Facebook, but some other social media platforms, has been a major headwind in our pandemic response. And we can't just blame that on the leadership of this country. We have to grapple with, what does that mean for our society and collective action more generally?
Right. I often hear people make the argument that, platforms like Facebook just kind of put a lens on human nature that has revealed itself repeatedly to us throughout history. I'm wondering if, as I recall from your book, John, that there were certainly people, at least in certain localities during 1918, 1919, putting spins on things, trying to downplay it, saying people didn't need to worry about it, let's go ahead and have the parade, etc. But it didn't seem like there was at least such widespread overt denialism of clear objectively true facts. Am I misremembering that, or was it just that it didn't propagate as widely?
First, let me comment on governors and so forth. I think that really does go back to the president. I think the governors are falling in line, and a lot of the Facebook misinformation and disinformation may be traced to the politicization of it as well. Although without any doubt, there would be crazy stuff out there if Trump were treating this like Angela Merkel. There would still be crazy stuff. But you wouldn't have a governor saying it. You wouldn't have a governor of Georgia saying, only 24 hours ago did I find out that's asymptomatic people could, this is when it had been out there for 4 months. 1918 was similar but dissimilar. The similarity was, in fact, that the government lied because they tried to minimize the pandemic. Their motivation was quite different. We were in the middle of the war, and Wilson feared that any distraction from the war effort would hurt it. I won't take the time to go into all the things they did to, quote, keep morale up. But that's why the government lied, and they were echoed largely by the media, which was complicit. Whereas now the media is actually trying to get truth out and doing a very good job of it. The thing is, it had very little impact in 1918 because the virus was different. The virus was much more lethal and much more virulent. In addition, the peak age for death was 28. Probably 2/3 of the dead were between 18 and 45. People could die, and roughly, I think it's 28% of the American public was infected. People could die in less than 24 hours after the first symptoms. Practically every city in the country ran out of coffins. So when you have situations like that, the real life experience of seeing your neighbor get carried out in a coffin, if there was a coffin available, then you're not going to believe someone telling you, an official government spokesperson saying this is ordinary influenza by another name. All that happens is it discredits the spokesperson. The geographic spread of this, initially on, the West Coast, primarily New York. I live in New Orleans, which briefly was the fastest growth rate in the world. But most of the middle of the country didn't see it, didn't have a personal experience. And then, of course, it's much less lethal.
Which brings us to sort of one of the lessons of your book is that sort of the virus changed and our response to it needed to change. And we right now are facing a sort of second wave, and there are places, as you say, that aren't even acknowledging or haven't experienced it firsthand. So how does our ability to continue to understand and adapt, how is that influenced by the fact that we might need to change guidelines that are already contentious, or we might need to adjust our response when people aren't even adapting to the first round of responses in this yet here?
You keep trying with the messaging. Somebody's asked me that question, fairly recently and I just said, you have to shout louder. I mean, you do everything you can do to get the message out. I'm actually a member of a group that has, made an effort to identify hotspot counties going back before the pandemic was widespread, and find local influencers that, maybe nobody nationally has heard of, but, in that particular area would have some influence. This group includes, some pretty high-powered people. We have gone at this point to getting, I guess we can claim some credit, for example, getting Tiffany Haddish to interview Tony Fauci, which I understand was an interview that Tony enjoyed quite a bit. It wasn't a standard take, but, trying to get that message out into that community, every avenue that you possibly can take. I'm not really an expert on that stuff.
Sure.
But there are people who are, you just keep trying. It's hard to overcome the person with the biggest megaphone.
Right. Well, Dr. Fenn, I'm wondering, the smallpox in 1776 predates even public health. I mean, it predates all of our modern communication infrastructure. Are we doing worse now than we were doing, back then before we even had the field or modern communication technology?
That really asks me to quantify things in a way that I don't think I am capable of. But I will say there were some familiar strains. There were controversies, for example, about inoculation. If you're not familiar with it, inoculation, at least in the 1770s and 80s, was different from the vaccination that Edward Jenner developed in 1796. With inoculation, you actually infect somebody with smallpox in the hope that they contract a mild case and thus have immunity. for life. It was quite an elaborate procedure, and it was expensive.
Can you describe it at all?
Yeah. So actually, we learned about it from Asia and Africa and the Middle East, interestingly. And I could tell you about how the way we learned about it, at least in this country, was that the Puritan divine Cotton Mather in Boston was a slave owner, and he had a Coromantee man in his possession, a man named Onesimus. And for reasons that are really quite obvious, a slave who had had smallpox was more valuable than one who had not, because they're not going to contract the disease and die of it. So Mather asked Onesimus one day, he said, "Hey, have you ever had smallpox?" And Onesimus looked at him, and Mather writes this in his journal. He says, "Yes and no." And then Onesimus describes to Mather this procedure his father had put him through in West Africa as a child, where his father had scratched or cut an incision in his hand or arm, implanted, and it's gross, but live pustular matter from a smallpox patient into the child's arm. He developed a mild case of the disease and had immunity for life. Now, when Europeans got hold of it, they elaborated on it, made it very complicated. You had to go through a month of preparation, and it became something that was really only available to the well-to-do, because you had to go into isolation, pay for the doctor, pay for the medications, the mercury that you drank and salivated and all that wonderful stuff. So the poor justifiably resented it, because those well-to-do inoculees came down with smallpox and they could spread it. So wealthy inoculees would put the rest of a population at risk.
So the vaccination didn't work that well, so they were actually contracting the disease.
Oh, yeah, you do contract disease. I mean, that's the principle. When you're inoculated with the variole virus, with the smallpox virus, you come down with it. And for reasons that even D.A. Henderson, who headed this smallpox eradication campaign, could not explain, inoculated smallpox is almost always milder than naturally contracted smallpox. So it's a gift, but you got to go through this. It's really going to be a 6 week to 8 week process with all the preparation involved, and then the disease itself takes a month. And it was deeply controversial. Yeah, it's really the origins of the anti-vax movement.
Not something that the FDA would quickly approve today.
They wouldn't approve that smallpox vaccine today.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I took you on the side route of telling us that excellent history of the procedure itself, but you were saying that there was controversy about it, and that maybe it's similar to threads that we're seeing today in terms of denialism or denying facts.
Well, I think a lot of, the controversy really broke down along economic lines. And I think some of what we are seeing today has to do with the state of our economy, and has to do with the fact that most of the population has languished for the last 40 years. And most of the population has seen elites get richer and richer. And we associate those elites with the experts in our world. And I think people have become pretty skeptical of the segment that is attached to universities and has made it.
Yeah. If only they knew the realities of academia. I want to continue to invite the audience to take us different places, and I want to make sure that, because we have so many ways we could go. We already have an audience question here that I want to get to right now, if that's okay with you, and then I'll get back to the line of questioning that I had in mind. So Barry's book notes not all doctors accepted germ theory of disease in 1918. Will there be a profound change to medicine itself after 2020? It's a difficult question, maybe.
I think Dr. Shah is probably better. I think by 1918, the germ theory disease was pretty well accepted. It wasn't that much prior to that the germ theory was still, I don't know that it was controversial, but it wasn't universally accepted. And some of the alternative theories were actually pretty sophisticated. There was a chemical theory. Chemistry was much more advanced than medicine was in the 19th century. And there was a chemical theory of disease that chemicals would start this chain reaction. And in fact, it's much like prions. Somebody won a Nobel Prize for prions, which is essentially that theory. But in terms of what will happen to medicine, we have someone else on the panel who's much more qualified to address than I.
Well, I did want to hear Mr. Berry's comments on this. I don't know that. Well, let me say a couple of things. I mean, first, the short answer is yes. Will there be important changes to medicine after this event? Absolutely. But maybe in my understanding, not as a historian, but as a reader of history, is that it's often very hard when you're in the middle of an event to predict all the ways in which society will change. 10 years from now, it'll look much more obvious, but today it looks a bit more murky. The couple of things I will say, I mean, within the medical field, there's not a whole lot of controversy or disagreement. Doctors, nurses, pretty much, much of the medical professions are aligned about what this is, what's going on, how we need to deal with it. I do think that it is disrupting the healthcare system in very profound ways. Some of it is obvious telemedicine, right? The idea that we're going to be able to do stuff differently. Telemedicine will be an important change. I think the changes of medicine and the relationship between medical professions and society are going to be much more profound than that. I think there has been a diminishing of that respect of doctors and nurses in the last 10, 15 years. And I think this event actually will renew it in a very different way. Doctors and nurses being seen as heroes, whether people like that analogy or not. So I think some of these very kind of profound social relationships that we have with the medical profession are going to change. I also think the way medicine is going to be practiced and funded is going to change. I think we have some ability to influence how those things happen. But it's hard for me to say with clarity, and here's what healthcare in America is going to look like in 2030. There's a lot of steps between now and then.
Yeah. I'm just looking to get through the winter, honestly.
Exactly.
I've got a question for Dr. Zaz.
Oh, yeah. Let's mix it up.
Research has changed. I mean, the cooperation between competing scientists, interdisciplinary work, I mean, that skyrocketed in the last 6 months. And of course, I think that would be a good thing if it's sustained. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, this is a really important point. And let me say 2 or 3 things on this. One is we are living through a very strange time because much of the medical scientific community is in this hyper-globalized, interdependent, interconnected world. And our political leaders are trying to create this sort of fragmentation that just goes against that. So let me explain a little bit on both of those ends. If you think about how this virus has kind of changed scientific collaboration, in early January, you have the sequencing of the genome. 2 days later, a German scientist essentially invents the test for the virus. And a week later, a South Korean company has figured out how to make large numbers of those tests, and it starts going. It went from a Chinese scientist decoding it, German scientist making the test, and a South Korean company then making mass amounts. And that's essentially a model for how all the scientific progress has gone, is that there is this constant flow of information. And yet, I get asked questions like, well, what do you think about the American vaccine? There's no American vaccine. right? Like we all talk about the Oxford AstraZeneca. It's Oxford University, a Swiss company. These are highly globalized events. And yet we have in our president, and he's not the only one, who wants to see the world through this lens that just doesn't make any sense right now. What I'm worried about, and just to go one step further, is if President Trump is reelected, the kind of global architecture we have created that allows for this kind of information sharing, that allows for these kinds of relationships, which have gotten very strained in the last 6 months, will actually break. And so our ability to sustain this kind of international cooperation on the science and knowledge generation, I think, is at risk because our president has a worldview that really kind of hinders this kind of global cooperation and intellectual engagement.
Well, I wonder if there are any historic lessons. Seems to be a tension that we see in pandemics. You know, you have the tension of local leaders at either a city, state, national level having a duty to shore up supplies, to keep their population safe. And also, knowing that if we collaborate as a scientific community, as a global health community, we would ultimately be more efficient and better prepared. Are there lessons that sort of prevent that fade into nationalism and to, shutting down communication as we withdrew from the World Health Organization, because we needed to scapegoat someone, whereas the World Health Organization itself has, arose to try to eradicate infectious diseases because we realized we had to come together. Are there lessons from past pandemics about avoiding that tendency to sort of withdraw and put up walls and barriers versus to build the collaborations that would be needed to prevent this from happening again?
Well, I mean, there are some lessons, and I think most of them are negative. I mean, as recently as 2009, I think Mexico was pretty candid and honest in that swine flu outbreak. But I've forgotten the exact numbers, but it's something like this. They spent $150 million fighting H1N1, and they suffered $9 billion in economic losses from international trade. I know that the European Union, the French in particular, immediately wanted to cancel all flights, wanted the EU to cancel all flights to Mexico and so forth and so on. That was not a good message to send out to countries when you want them to be transparent with the world about an infectious disease.
Yeah.
I think, even from the perspective of the 18th century and earlier, it's really clear that no particular civilization has a lock on knowledge. And when I investigate smallpox, the Chinese learn about inoculation from Nepal, right? England learns about inoculation from Constantinople. Cotton Mather learns about inoculation from an African. No particular civilization has a lock on knowledge, and the more we unlock that knowledge and facilitate that communication, the better off we are going to be. Information, everything.
Yeah, but nobody had a patent on that inoculation either.
Actually, some people tried to.
Did they?
Some British doctors tried to patent their own method and keep it a secret, and they kept it a secret for about 30 years. The Suttons in England try to keep their method a secret.
It seems pretty straightforward, though, right?
Well, they had a special preparation for it that was supposed to induce a milder case of the disease.
Okay. Yeah. John, you mentioned of Mexico's, the costs, the money put into this, and then the cost to the economy. In the case of swine flu, I recall in Dr. Fenn, in your book, that the global eradication effort of smallpox, you had a number in there. I believe, if off the top of my head, it was $100 million
That sounds right. Yeah.
1970s and 80s dollars. But
Yeah,
so more now. But you know, if you were to compare that to the cost of, you know, if you were having continued pandemics, smallpox, it seems that we would learn from the past that you can save a lot of money by taking upfront action. Did we not learn that from smallpox?
You can save a lot of money and a lot of angst by taking action. And even when you're in the midst of international rivalries, you have two choices. And what happened with the eradication of smallpox is that, you know, we're in the middle of the Cold War, right? And the United States and the Soviet Union both egged each other on to contribute more. And it led to collaboration and kind of a competition to let's show that we, you know, we're going to show that, you know, show that our system is better by contributing more to this effort. And instead, we've gone the opposite way.
That's an interesting force. Could we harness that somehow?
Wouldn't that be great? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically, maybe Dr. Jar can speak to this, the vaccine efforts, which, you know, to my eye, we had this early collaboration, certainly, that you describe. Now there's some degree of competition, which might be held. Is there too much competition, not enough information sharing in the vaccine process right now to get it as you know, as quickly as possible?
We're right at that tipping point. This could go in one of two ways. And so let me, so there's something called COVAX, which has been spearheaded by Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and WHO. And basically what it is it says countries commit to working together so that they try to essentially focus on getting up to 20% of each nation's people vaccinated before others do. And 20% should give you enough for frontline workers, healthcare workers, and some very high risk individuals. And so instead of everybody trying to inoculate everybody in their population, let's make sure there's enough vaccines for the first 20% of every country. That will have a profound effect. And then as more vaccines come online, there's more distribution. Seems like a really good idea. And 170 some odd countries have signed up. I mean, the U.S. has played no role in this, and the U.S. but it's really the only major country that said, we're sitting this out, we're going to just do this on our own. What's interesting, so it sounds great, global collaboration, right? Cooperation, exactly what we'd want. Countries are also making side deals with manufacturers in case this little cooperation doesn't work out. But unfortunately, those side deals may end up making the cooperation not work out. So that's why it is interesting, because on one hand, this could end up being this incredible global success story where you really brought the pandemic under control in much of the world at the same time. And that would be awesome. And there are huge benefits to people in high income countries of doing that, because we are in a global world. And if no one in India has gotten vaccinated and everybody in the UK has gotten vaccinated, not everybody, but let's say 80%, that's a huge problem. It's geopolitically a problem. It's also from a public health point of view, a problem. So it's actually quite a good model. I am worried that in the execution, too many countries are going to, when it comes down to it, are going to think it's kind of a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, right? If you cooperate, everybody wins, but it feels like you have an advantage by pulling out. So I don't know which way it's going to go. I know which way the US has voted on this, but most of the other countries are going to try.
And even in the U.S., I mean, obviously, if Trump is reelected, there will not be cooperation there. But the U.S. has contracted for 1.5 billion doses of vaccine. And even if most of them, although there are a couple under development that only require one shot, most of them do require two. If those things come online, there will be an excess capacity of vaccines, which could end up filtering its way into COVAX. At least, you know, the optimists.
That would be great. That'd be
I want to jump to another audience question. If anyone's just joining us, please feel free to drop them in the comments. Don't know if anyone knows the answer to this. I don't. But in the 1790s, a yellow fever epidemic divided parties over whether yellow fever was contagious or not. Could you possibly talk about any of the any essential similarities or differences with today's situation?
Gosh, I'm not sure how it compares to today's situation.
Well,
It was an incredible.
I mean, for me,
Yeah.
I'm grasping for lessons that I could make.
So it was just an amazing episode. Basically, the island of Haiti had a revolution in 1789 that sent this diasporic migration out of Haiti, fleeing this successful Black Revolution. And immigrants from Haiti arrived up and down the Atlantic seaboard in the 1790s. One city, Philadelphia, developed a very severe yellow fever epidemic. Interestingly, Philadelphia was the capital of the country at this time, and the Haitian emigres had brought yellow fever with them to Philadelphia, and it was catastrophic. Benjamin Rush, the famous American doctor, just exhausted himself, contracted yellow fever himself, treating patients, bleeding and purging, and he probably killed far more people than he saved, but he was very, very dedicated to it. And politically, it was quite fascinating because there was one faction, as the questioner suggests, that argued that it was contagious person to person. People didn't understand that it was mosquito-borne. And another faction just argued that it was an imported disease and somehow not contagious. Congress did not deport itself well. All the members of Congress fled. George Washington left, and it pretty much was left to the African American population of Philadelphia to clean up the streets, tend to the victims, bury the dead. So in that respect, it certainly reflects the sort of the fault lines of society in many ways that are similar to what we are seeing today, where poor and working people bear the brunt of an epidemic, and then it manifests in political ways too. Federalists tended to think one way about the epidemic. It reflected party alignments and so on.
That's something, a theme that I wanted to draw out too, is this sort of perennial throughout pandemic start history. We've seen who is affected most, who is hit hardest. Yet when this, some people were referring to COVID in the early days as maybe the great equalizer, as thinking this is something that's going to affect everyone, and in some ways it does. No one is not affected at all, but it's clearly showing casting a lens on all the disparities that are part of society. And John, could you speak maybe a little bit to how that happened in 1919 as well?
Well, clearly density population is a factor in spread. They had some pretty good epidemiologists, very good epidemiologists who looked at this and can tell you and came up with contemporaries back then who studied it and found what you would expect. And obviously, if you have more people in a household and fewer square feet, that relates to socioeconomic. Interestingly, African Americans did not suffer disproportionately in terms of morbidity. The number of people who got sick, they actually, for whatever reason, I've never heard a hypothesis explaining it, but there's somewhat lower morbidity among African Americans. They did have higher mortality if they did get sick. You could say they might have gotten worse medical care, but there really wasn't anything that medicine could do for you in 1918 unless you were really lucky and located in a tiny handful of places that, where they did use oxygen, didn't really know how to administer it. If you were infected with a secondary bacterial pneumonia, most people probably died of that. They developed vaccines for different bacterial pneumonias. If you happen to get a vaccine that hit the bacteria pneumonia that you were about to be exposed with, maybe that would have done some good. But there really wasn't anything medicine could do for you. And so you had the socioeconomic difference, which of course we have today. But you didn't have the racial disparities that we have today.
I recall also you describing some people wearing extremely inefficient masks, that probably there's some analog today. We have a viewer question asking for historical precedent on getting folks to wear masks at all. You mentioned that there might have been a little bit more buy-in to the concept that the pandemic in 1918 was dangerous, that it was indeed a thing. There was not denialism about the danger itself because people had firsthand experience. But could public health experts learn something from the communication in terms of how do you get people to take preventive measures?
Well, I mean, they tried the masking. They actually learned and, ran some very good experiments. They could tell you how far droplets would travel and so forth, and ran some very good experiments in 1917 because of the measles epidemic in army camps on masks, and realized that putting a mask on somebody who was sick was actually quite effective. They knew that back then. However, and a lot of cities required masks. I don't think there was a lot of pushback. I've seen a lot of stuff in the press in the last few months about the anti-masking league in San Francisco and so forth, suggesting that there was a lot of pushback. I don't think that was really the case because of the lethality of the disease. What's interesting, though, is that, there are a lot of very careful, comprehensive looks in the aftermath of the pandemic about the pandemic. And they all agreed that putting a mask on somebody who was sick was helpful. But they concluded that for the general public, it was not useful. Possibly because the mask, in those days, they were primarily using gauze.
Yeah, they didn't have N95s for sure.
No, they certainly didn't, but the simple gauze mask was the most common mask, and that really didn't stop much of anything. And based on that data, actually, in the early days of this, if somebody asked me about masking, I would say, not so sure. The real difference between then and now is the asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission. I mean, there is, to my knowledge, and maybe both you and she's are docs, I'm not, but I don't think influenza has asymptomatic transmission. You have pre-symptomatic transmission, but not asymptomatic. But the pre-symptomatic is for a few hours, maybe a day. Whereas in this disease, you have substantial asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission. And that makes a huge difference in why masks are effective now.
Yeah. If anyone's wearing a gauze mask, people ask me what kind of mask should I be wearing, and there's a lot that can work, but gauze is out. We've learned that, at least, if we can take away something from 19.
So, can I ask a quick? Because John mentioned a while back that there were no treatments for the influenza, and most of us on this screen, maybe Dr. Hamblin, you're an exception. I think you're a little younger than the rest of us, but we have come of age, in an era in which, up until the HIV and AIDS epidemic, infectious disease was not an issue for us in the developed world. And HIV and AIDS changed that. But I still feel as though many of us in the developed world still have this kind of arrogance, this hubris that, infectious disease just there's a cure for it. You just go to the doctor and get a shot, or we had this antibiotic window with the development of penicillin that changed the outcome of World War II in many respects for anybody who was wounded. And we all went to the doctor and got antibiotics way too frequently as we grew up. But I wonder if it hasn't made us naive about what infectious disease really means.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Jha, do you think, we find ourselves in 2020 for periods unable to buy toilet paper or bicycles and unable to leave our home, having bandanas around our faces, and meanwhile we have $1 million robots who can do hysterectomies. Are we going to reallocate our confidence and our resources in public health and medicine moving forward?
Yeah, I do think we will. I think what Dr. Fenn said is exactly right, that we've had a long kind of decline in our fear of infectious diseases. Yes, HIV definitely shifted that a little, but it didn't affect the whole population in the same way. And we figured out at some point how you could avoid it largely, and then we developed effective therapies. And then a generation kind of grew up not even worrying about HIV so much, right? So, but where we have, what has happened is that as a result, all of our kind of investments in public health have been slowly but surely getting shifted to the healthcare system. And, I'd love to say that was a conservative or a liberal thing. It's been a bipartisan thing. Mm-hmm. We have just, because the sense was, at the end of the day, what really mattered was personal medicine. Even the Affordable Care Act, which I supported, it had some money for public health, but at the end of the day, not that much. And then when the funding got tight because of the way Congress acted in 2010, we took money from public health to put it into the healthcare system to give people coverage. And I'm all for giving people coverage. But that attitude, I think, has been a major reason why we find ourselves where we are. And I think there is little doubt in my mind that there's going to be a re-examination of that. Whether that happens at the federal level, it happens at the state level, we can talk about. Whether it happens within the healthcare system or whether we really securitize this and make this a national security issue, which has some upsides and a lot of downsides of treating public health as a national security issue. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen as a result of this pandemic. But the short answer is absolutely, we're going to think about this differently.
Yeah. Is there any historical precedent for thinking about this as a national security issue? I mean, I've, in recent years, certainly thought about that way, but when we look more than a few decades back, was that was certainly, if we're talking about it, factoring into the Revolutionary War, this was
and World War One,
right? Do you, Dr. Fenn, do you think that would be a more reasonable direction to shift now, or is there historic reason not to?
I don't think I can answer that question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No. In terms of pandemic preparedness, that was linked to national security and bio defense.
Mm-hmm.
It got funding on that basis. But going back, I mean, the Army Surgeon General in World War I, Gorgas, who was a terrific leader and a great doctor and scientist, he was determined in advance of that war that World War I would be the first war in which more people died in combat than from disease. Now, because of the pandemic, he failed to hit that mark. But there was, a real effort to make Army medicine first rate, and it was in that war. And since then, I think the institution, World War II, I mean, they were very cognizant of influenza. They did a tremendous amount of work, fearing another pandemic, development of, they obviously didn't invent or discover penicillin, but advanced its production and stuff like that. And in again, the pandemic preparedness area, unlike more mundane aspects of public health, which are equally, if not more important. But there had been a national security part of it. What I'm concerned about going forward is, given the extraordinary amounts of money the federal government has spent so far, and hopefully we'll get another stimulus package of some kind, the fiscal position of the government is the worst that it's ever been. I think it may well end up worse than coming out of World War II in terms of debt and things like that. So the fiscal pressure on spending, and every state has lost so much money, tax revenues, businesses, and so forth. They're in equally bad shape, and the public health expenditures in the states has also declined precipitously in the last 15 years. Yeah. It's not just the feds. So as we go forward, I'm sure short term there'll be a lot of investment in virology and so forth, and maybe some broad spectrum antivirals and all sorts of nice things like that. But once our memory fades of this a little bit, 5 years or a little bit longer, I'm pretty worried, because that fiscal pressure is really going to continue. That's not going away.
Right. So that leads to an excellent viewer question, of which we'll have time for maybe one, maybe two more. What are some of the economic impacts of past pandemics? I can't imagine it's ever good, but have we managed to not suffer so badly economically through any ingenious methods in the past?
Not that I know of.
Pretty much.
I mean, certainly in the great cholera epidemics of the 19th century, cities shut down. They really did, and people left. Maybe economies in surrounding communities flourished to some extent. That was true for the yellow fever 1793 too. It was very similar. Very similar.
People left the cities, but they come back, right? I mean, ultimately, that's our nature and our economic necessity. Yeah. Sorry, Dr. Zhang.
It's fine, but can I point out that this, raises a really important problem, which is, and we can talk about why China in this context did not share with the world what was going on, or why the local leaders of Wuhan did not share more widely with the Chinese government. And of course, our president loves to beat up on China for that. And this is one of the places where he's right. China really did mishandle this quite badly through probably much of November and December. But the point on this is not a China problem. This is essentially what happened in West Africa for months in the Ebola outbreak. This happens over and over again.
Yeah.
Because what happens is it's so clear that if you declare a bad outbreak, it has this huge negative economic effect.
Right.
That you want to be really, really sure you're having a bad outbreak before you do this. But by the time you're really, really, really sure, things have often gotten very bad. Right. And then it's easy to look back and say, well, you knew 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago, why didn't you? Yeah. So the world has tried to solve this, certainly coming out of Ebola, with some instruments that have gone very badly. They didn't work. So for instance, the World Bank created this pandemic bond, this idea that if you declare a big outbreak, you will and it turns out to be a pandemic or something substantial, you'll actually get a big economic stimulus. To create an incentive for people to report, or at least to reduce the disincentive of not reporting. And what's interesting, and I'm not going to get it quite right, but through end of August, the pandemic bonds had still not paid out. And all of us were like, if this is not enough of a pandemic to pay out for, like, what on earth are we talking about? So they clearly didn't structure it right. I'm not even sure that's the right instrument, but the motivation is right. Which is, we've got to create financial incentives for local organizations, for local municipalities, for countries to report this stuff. But we have to be very clear, because they know that if they declare it, people are going to shut down flights. I mean, what John was saying earlier about what happened with Mexico.
Right.
like just saying, oh, you should do it out of the goodness of your heart. If it's going to destroy your economy, you're going to have a very high bar for doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
What strikes me as a phenomenon that comes down even to the individual level, you know, even within a country, you have to have an incentive for, say, a waiter at to not go to work as soon as they are symptomatic, as opposed to trying to downplay things. You know, how do you shift those incentives so that people are, you know, able to? Because you might have the best of intentions in some of these localities and some of these individuals, but they simply couldn't take the economic hit of rolling the dice. And so they'll choose to hope it was not something bad and spread a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, that's true not just of pandemics, but business communities tend not to want any bad news to get out about. I mean, I can think of a flood, Mississippi River flood that was threatening New Orleans, and you couldn't read a word in the New Orleans newspaper. Every other newspaper in the country was writing about it, but not in New Orleans. Not a word about this great flood threat. And, you know, that was not unusual. And, you know, pretty much every disease, and, you know, Elizabeth can talk about not just cholera, but all. And same thing with yellow fever. I'm more familiar with 1878, and which was that yellow fever here went all the way up the Mississippi River to the Midwest. The same kinds of things. You know, people are fleeing the cities, but you're not reading a word about it in the newspapers. And the business community is, you know, shutting down any discussion of it.
So just one quick thing on this. So a bunch of us, again, kind of naively, things I've gotten wrong, long list. 10 years ago, I thought this problem is going to go away because when the world is hyper-connected and when information flows, like you can't keep an outbreak this size in Wuhan because people of Wuhan are connected to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the world will know whether the Chinese government tells WHO or not. It doesn't matter. That was my worldview a decade ago. And again, I've already admitted that was clearly wrong. And the way that turned out to be wrong was that as much as we sort of like to believe that the internet is a pure information democratization tool, there are lots of ways in which the information coming through places like China, Russia are deeply manipulated. So yeah, there were lots of people getting sick and dying in Wuhan in November and December, but the world did not know about it largely. And that unto itself tells us something about information flow and how it's not nearly as ubiquitous and easy as we thought it was, or at least I thought it was going to be.
Right.
We also thought China had learned from SARS.
Right.
And they were much more communicative on H5N1. They were quite transparent on H5N1. And, you know, this may have been more a localized problem. I guess ProMed had something on December 30th, which I think was the earliest notice of something going on. But as you said, it was pretty bad by then.
We have a viewer question here that I think could kind of tie this all together, tie together some of the themes that we've talked about here, which I thank you all for all the time and patience and sharing your expertise. And I guess it seems like we're coming back to issues that sometimes are just attributed to human nature. We have a public amnesia. We'll only remember a threat for a few years, and then we move on to something else, and we forget to invest. But there's this tension here, clearly, where there are also concerted disinformation campaigns. There are bad actors. There are self-motivated people trying to pollute and pollute the information ecosystem and downplay problems even though they know. So the question here is, could you speak to how public amnesia of pandemics has contributed to misunderstandings of disease and ability to combat these issues? And I'm just wondering if you can draw out kind of to what degree is this inevitable human nature that we tend to only think about the most pressing threats, and to what degree is it self-interest or disinformation that we could actually do something about? If it's not an easy question to answer, maybe it's too big, but if there's anything in the past where you could say we were able to eliminate, this information flow. We were able to create this system, and it was, even for a brief period, working well.
Well, while
Sorry.
Oh no.
No, so I was going to say, while I let our historians think for a second, let me make a point on this so I've been saying, I've been thinking, and it's not my idea alone. A lot of us have been saying that the way we have thought about disease outbreaks is that we vacillate between panic and neglect. That when there's a large outbreak, we all panic, throw lots of resources. Oh my God, we got to deal with this. In West Africa, we send in the US military. And then it was over, and we thought, thank God, well, we'll never have another disease outbreak again. And then we proceeded to neglect. And so people talk a lot about human nature, and I wonder if that's right. And the reason I ask is we have been willing as a country, as a society, as a world, to fund things, pay for things where we don't see it happening on a day-to-day basis. What I'm thinking about is, for instance, terrorism, or, we had a catastrophic event on 9/11. We ramped up our spending on terrorism, and we can talk about whether that was the right way to spend it, but we did, and we have sustained it, and we have continued to spend, and no one questions our spending on the military or terrorism, even though we're not being attacked. We can talk about people think we're spending too much, but majority of Americans still feel that we need to be spending some amount on national defense, even though it's not born out of a daily attack that we're experiencing.
Right.
Clearly, there's something about that works for people, where the disease model has not worked for people. And I can't tell if it's because one feels natural and the other one is perpetrated or I've really struggled with this. Why are we willing to do it for one but not the other? I'd love to hear whether John or Elizabeth have any thoughts on this.
I get asked a question much less complex than that one a lot. Why haven't more people written about 1918 pandemic? Why isn't more part of public consciousness and stuff like that? I've never had a really satisfactory answer. I think in the academic community, among historians, until relatively recently, maybe 40 years ago, with the emergence of the beginning of the field of environmental history, historians tended to write about what people did to people and not what nature did to people. And if that hypothesis is correct, it kind of applies to the point that you were just making. And that seems to be the focus. I will also say regarding pandemics, what Elizabeth was saying earlier about the golden age of antibiotics and not expecting infectious disease to be a real threat until HIV reminded us. That I think thinking is still out there. And HIV is a reminder, but it's also a special case. And even that has now been somewhat put in a box, although there are some strains out there that are resistant to the cocktails.
Yeah, I'm completely sympathetic to the problem Dr. Jha has raised. When I teach my history of epidemic disease class, I call it the paradox of prevention. That successful prevention is a non-event that cultivates skepticism of future prevention efforts. And the other distinction I'll add that, John pointed out that terrorism wars are about people doing things to people. And epidemics are caused by microbes, and they're invisible. And I think that makes them much less tangible to human beings.
Yeah.
And do you think it leads to a certain level of fatalism? Like, well, we can't control it. I'm just wondering, because I
don't know.
Like the argument that we in public health make that you never see our successes, that's also CIA's line, right? We fund the CIA quite generously.
Yeah, indeed.
We don't fund public health so generously. And that is a paradox I've struggled with and I haven't, but maybe it is fatalism. Maybe it is the sense of like, human behavior versus environment. I don't know. It's been an interesting challenge.
Incidentally, the same thing applies to social distancing and things like that. It's too late to be really effective if you wait until it's obvious you need it. You know, the earlier you intervene, the more effective it is, the less obvious it becomes. You know, I think going back to a question about the economy, that maybe a point's worth making, it comes to me now. I mean, first, in 1918, one of the big differences between 1918 and today is duration. You know, influenza would hit a community in 10 weeks, it'd be gone. And then it'd be gone. And, you know, some communities had another wave, not all. But again, they had a gap and then another 6 weeks or so, and it was gone. There was a pretty steep recession, but recovery was very quick. This virus, even if we had not done anything to intervene, the duration is much longer. The incubation period's at least 3 times as long, and in some cases a lot more than that. You shed virus longer. You know, everything is stretched out, which is put an enormous stress. And, you know, and then to save lives, which I entirely applaud, especially since I'm over 70. So I have self-interest there. You know, to save lives, we've intervened in the transmission, stretching it out even further. So the stress on society, everyday life, right now is actually, I think, greater than it was in 1918 because of the duration. You know, because even within that 6 to 10 week period, it was less than that you were dealing with the social disruption, because it took a while before you recognized you had a problem.
Well, okay. I worry that I have just sown a lot of hopelessness by asking questions that you know, don't have real answers, and we've at least helped to show the complexity of the problems before us and how much we can learn from history. I recommend the writings of all of you to everyone who's watching. Is there maybe some cognitive exercise or something that you tell yourself, something concise that you do in your moments when you're feeling, I imagine you are, because I certainly am, like, this is just, history is going to keep repeating itself. These problems are too big for us to ever really tackle. If you're feeling, when you get that feeling washing over you, do you tell yourself anything? Is there any way that you you know, pull through and get yourself back on the horse to keep doing the good work that you're doing?
Yeah, I just take it one day at a time.
Yeah.
You know, and try to be kind to the people around me in every interaction of every day, because it's really easy to get short-tempered.
So I'll go with that. I have nothing deep to say regarding that.
Let me maybe take a slightly different thought on this, which is, so I've been feeling like we are entering this age of pandemics. Number of outbreaks has been going up. This pandemic is driven in part by globalization, in part by environmental change, the economic growth of China. It is not a surprise that SARS came out of China. This SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 is. The next pandemic might come from India, it might come from, it could come from Kansas, but the point is that it will become global very quickly. It's human activity, human behavior, and the way that we are changing the environment that is driving a lot of this. That's the bad news. The good news, and what keeps me going, is it is human ingenuity, human creativity, our ability to work across borders, little political editorializing, even with the most kind of ineffective, incompetent leader, the global scientific community has pulled through on this one in a way that is extraordinary, and I think we're only going to get better. So there's always this little bit of, like, in one way we're making things worse, but it is our ability to work together, to use our creativity to solve these problems that will lead to a vaccine. We will have a vaccine that's safe and effective, identified before the end of this year, before the 1-year anniversary of the Chinese government telling WHO that we had a problem. That is extraordinary. And I suspect that that is only going to get better over time. So as long as we keep emphasizing those strengths of the human race, I think we can get through this and the future ones. But we've got to fight the forces that tear us apart.
I should clarify, just because this is a question I get a lot too. By the end of the year, we will have at least a vaccine, like one dose, or probably more doses.
Most of us are
not going to have one for everyone.
No, we're not going to get. Most of us are not going to get vaccinated.
Right.
No,
yeah.
We will identify.
Yeah, John, did you have a follow-up?
That is extraordinary, but even that is.
Oh no, yeah, it's wonderful. It is. I'm trying to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't mean to over.
Yeah, I more or less remained silent when you asked me before because you wanted something positive and inspirational.
I feel obligated to manage people's
and people go around quoting Santayana, and whenever somebody does that, I think of Hegel, who said, "What we learn from history is we learn nothing from history."
Yeah, that's right.
But the reality is, there are countries that have done a remarkably good job with this. And what Dr. Jha was saying about the scientific community and the public health community, which is essentially unanimous on this, that's true. And I agree with it. Maybe one thing that I know it astounded me, and I think it probably astounded my friends who were involved in preparedness. I never imagined that through, quote, non-pharmaceutical interventions alone, that you could do as well in controlling a highly transmissible virus as some places have done. That is extraordinary. And it does show us that even starting where we are now, we have tremendous amount of control over what happens to us and to the country should we choose to exercise that control. And you can exercise it in your small circle, even if the locality or somewhere else or the country, depending on leadership and so forth, doesn't do it.
Yeah.
And, I've been contradicted on this because it varies place to place. Louisiana is a red state. We do have a Democratic governor who I think has done a pretty good job on this. But walking around the French Quarter, actually right now I'm sitting in DC, but I live in New Orleans and be back there soon. There has been an increase in the number of people wearing masks, significant increase. And the people in the French Quarter aren't so much the full-time residents. Even now, although tourism, of course, has dropped way down, there are tourists. So I'm measuring, in my view, people who are coming from outside New Orleans. And many more of them are wearing masks. So that made me somewhat hopeful. Although I was talking to somebody today who was reporting to me on what was going on in another part of the country, the Dakotas, which right now is beginning to skyrocket, saying never see anybody in a mask.
You were getting hopeful there for a second, and now we're back.
It's a big country.
Okay. Well, I should close there. Thank you so much to all of you. I would love to continue talking or to actually do this every single night. This was really helpful for me. And we won't, but thank you all. And good night, everyone.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.